Hey everyone, welcome to video 4, chapter 7, and today we're going to be talking about economic recovery in the Middle Ages. So one of the things that made the Dark Ages was the lack of trade and economic advancement. Feudalism resulted in these self-sufficient manners that didn't really need to rely on the outside world. It also made European society kind of stuck in place for a while in terms of advances. This starts to change by the later Middle Ages though. Trade is going to begin to open up again, and some significant changes are going to take place. Now what kicks off these changes is an agricultural revolution. The changes in economic prosperity begins in the countryside, when we're going to see some changes in farming. This agricultural revolution was due mostly to improvements in farming technology. By the 800s, peasants were using iron plows. Now, a plow is the thing that you hook up to horses or oxen or any type of animal that can pull it, and it digs through the ground and kind of makes like a little bit of almost like a mini trench that you would then put the seeds in and cover it up. Now, these plows that are made of iron, they could carve deeper into the soil and, more importantly, didn't break as easy as plows made out of stone and wood. Especially in those northern European soil, it's pretty tough up there. Another improvement was better harnesses for the plows. Now, the harness is a thing that straps around the animal's kind of neck and shoulder area and so forth. This new harness was more on the chest, and it took pressure off of the horse's neck and made it easier for them to move faster and work longer. Both of these improvements meant fields could be plowed faster, meaning they could plant more food and more crops could be harvested. And aside from the technology, there was also some improvements in farming techniques. The most notable was this thing called the three-field rotation system. The three-field system was a way to rotate crops. All right, so you look at this one here. You've got your little village, right, with the church in the middle. You've got your fancy manor house where the Lord lived down here. And then you got three fields. One is wheat, one's barley, and the other is what's called fallow, where the animals will graze. What you do is you leave it like that for a couple months, and then you rotate it, right? So now the wheat field will move over here, the animals are going to move over here, and the barley here. What this does is it kind of prevents the soil from being used up too fast, because allowing the animals to graze on it, the animals are going to eat. And what happens also is they are going to, we all know what happens at the end result of eating. So basically, animal poop is going to be a form of fertilizer for the ground, and it re-enriches the soil. So you just keep on this rotation, and you never overdo it with the farming, and the soil will stay rich, and then you can keep on farming over the long run. Now, what all of this amounts to is that it allows people to grow more crops, which meant more food. And we know that more food equals more people. As the food supply increased, so too did the population levels of Europe. Now, as Europe's population grew, other changes took place. Around the year 1000, we're going to start seeing a revival of trade and travel throughout Europe. Remember, during the Dark Ages, not a lot of trade going on because people weren't traveling. It wasn't safe. You had constant warfare. You didn't have stable governments that could protect trade routes. Well, by the 1100s or so, feudal warfare had declined. People were starting to feel safer and began to travel more. This in turn led to an expansion of trade routes. Traders formed merchant companies that traveled trade routes that hadn't been used for centuries. This expansion of trade led to an increase in demand for foreign goods. So you look at the map here, all the different lines for the different routes. Don't worry about the different trade areas. That's not stuff that we're really going to talk about. Just know that those are areas that were controlled by different trade organizations. The routes are what we really want to look at. But especially how now these European routes that you find in Western Europe are being connected into the Middle East and the Far East, right? You're getting this stuff here. So now you're getting spices, you're getting silk, all this stuff that had been cut off from Europe in the early Middle Ages starting to make its way back in. And most of them were coming in through Italy. All right, most of them were coming in through Italy right here, through Italian port cities like Venice. Now, speaking of cities, towns and cities started to make a comeback. Cities developed along trade routes. Trade brings people and areas, trade brings people to areas that bring a lot of trade, and it's going to bring people. And so let me just erase this. There we go. All right. So you look at this map. you see how you've got major commercial centers. Most of them are here in northern Italy. As I just said, it's these kind of sea trade routes that are coming in. But you got a lot that are going up through along the Atlantic coast, some even going up to England, up here as well, up here in northern Europe, like Germany and Scandinavia and so forth. Now, a lot of these cities developed at locations that began as trade fairs, right? You see this here, towns holding fairs. Trade fairs were seasonal gatherings of merchants. People would travel to the fair and they would buy and sell goods. Eventually, many of these merchants settled in the area of these trade fairs. Consequently, with more people settling in an area, a need grew for craftsmen and business owners. More people began moving to these areas for job opportunities, and a town or a city is born. The expansion of trade in cities leads to changes in how people do business. We call this a commercial revolution. Commercial in this sense refers to commerce. Commerce is just the buying and selling of goods. Trade leads to a revival of money. Money wasn't necessary for a feudal society to function. Vassals didn't need to pay lords money for fiefs, they just had to swear loyalty. Lords didn't need to pay serfs for their work. Serfs were allowed to live on the land as long as they worked it. But no money was really exchanged. Trade is different, though. If merchants travel long distances to sell goods, it's a lot easier to deal with this stuff. Dealing with money, dealing with coins, it makes it easier. And as money makes a comeback, we start to see the beginning of a lot of modern business practices, such as banking. Merchants traveling distances with money wasn't safe and it wasn't practical. To make it easier to do business, banks started opening in trade towns for merchants to both deposit and withdraw money. Another way, for merchants to protect their investments was to form partnerships. They would combine their resources to finance large-scale ventures that would have been too expensive for a single merchant. They also started using insurance to protect these ventures. If a ship or trade caravan was lost, insurance allows a merchant to recover money for that loss. One other business method that made things easier was the use of credit. This was a business practice that European merchants learned from Muslim merchants. Using credit means that money doesn't need to be physically exchanged. Now a merchant could use a note of credit that could then be cashed in for money at his local bank. This way, he doesn't need to carry gold on his journey, which would be stolen. All of these changes in trade and how people do business are going to eventually have some pretty profound impacts on society. For example, the use of money led to a decline in serfdom. Serfdom is just the institution of having serfs. As I said earlier in the video, serfs aren't paid in money. As money continues to circulate throughout medieval society, the whole concept of serfdom becomes unnecessary. Now, it's important to note, though, that this does not happen quickly, but rather over hundreds of years, and it definitely does not mean that all serfs rise in social class. They're still poor, but rather than be serfs tied to the land, many now become what we call tenant farmers. A tenant just means that you pay rent, right? So they pay the lord to rent the use of the land. Probably the biggest change in medieval society at this time was the expansion of the middle class. Feudalism is based around almost everybody falling into two social groups. You got your nobles and you got your peasants. You didn't have much of a middle class because you really didn't need one on the manor. The lord owned the manor and the peasants worked on it. But now, towns and cities are starting to have a more diverse social order. So this is what the old European feudal system. All three of these up at the top were your wealthier nobility, and then you just got your peasants down here at the bottom. Towns and cities, though, they're developing different ones. So now you still have your ones up at the top, including the Pope and the Church, right? We talked about them in the last section. But now you also have merchants. You got some wealthier farmers, now that I said serfdom starting to develop. And you also have craftsmen. Those are skilled laborers like blacksmiths and carpenters. Now, these people weren't as wealthy as the nobles, but they weren't poor peasants either. They were in the middle of these two groups, hence the name middle class. The nobles weren't always the biggest fans of the middle class because nobles believed the middle class upset the order of how society should be, with them on the top and everybody else being poor and on the bottom. The middle class, though, it steadily gained power and influence in towns and cities. And to protect this power and influence, they formed these things called guilds. Guilds were organizations of merchants and craftsmen. Just erase this. Okay. Now, they were similar in some ways to modern-day labor unions. Think of them like the ancestor of labor unions. Guilds protected their members in a number of ways. They cut down on competition. They did this by limiting membership. If you wanted to work as a merchant or craftsman in a town, you had to be a guild member. You couldn't go into business for yourself. They also regulated everything within a certain industry, such as setting prices and rules on the quality of the goods. Because guilds were so strict about membership and its rules, it wasn't easy to join. You couldn't just sign up and be a full-fledged guild member. You had to go through what's called an apprentice system. An apprentice is someone training to be a full-fledged guild member. Here you have this young man here was an apprentice baker for somebody, for the baker in the town or the city. Guild members typically started training as a child and spent years under the tutelage of a guild master to learn the trade. All right, so that you had to pay your dues. So that will wrap things up for section 4. It also wraps things up for chapter 7, but we're actually going to continue on with talking about the Middle Ages in chapter 8 when we get into the later Middle Ages.